Firstly, I'd like to welcome a new speaker for us who'll be talking about ecosystem approaches to learning. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Serj Hunt. He's a product manager from Galileo XP, a company based in the US. I think he's actually joining us from Indonesia. Mr. Hunt, feel free to say hi and introduce yourself and get started with your session.
Lovely. So as advertised, this presentation is titled City as a School, an ecosystems approach to lifelong learning. My name is Serj Hunt. I'm currently based in Indonesia, but I'm originally from the UK. My background is in UX and learning experience design. I tend to go by the term of technologist, meaning I connect research and big ideas and bring them into implementation. I'm an associate at Wild Learning Sciences, which is based in the UK. If you were present for Ruth Crick's talk, I think earlier in this program, you'll be familiar with some of that work, but it's all about assessment of learning power and new forms of learning analytics. I was previously a product manager at Galileo, which was a global learning ecosystem for kids age 8 to 18, which served over 400 families with alternative learning provisions around the world. And I'm currently a founder at the City as a School, which is a tech platform for enabling these learning ecosystems at the city level. I wanted to start today's presentation with setting the stage. As you're probably aware, we are beset, humanity as a whole, by a whole pantheon of wicked problems. Problems like natural ecosystems collapse, accelerated breakdown of social and political coherence, and all this rising exponential technology. I'd go as far as to say that we're in an educational crisis. An educational crisis occurs when our capabilities, individually or societally, can't meet the complex demands of our rapidly complexifying world. And so I've been pondering this question a lot, which is what kinds of education systems can adapt and keep pace with this rate of social and technological change? I want to make a few key points in this presentation. I want to make a case for why learning ecosystems are an essential design pattern for education systems over the next 100 years, focusing specifically on learning ecosystems at the city or municipal level. To do that, I'll be also going through the current state and theory of the practice around learning ecosystems, briefly covering 3 case studies. And then at the end, we'll be wrapping up by asking the questions, do these real-world learning ecosystems really represent a new learning paradigm? And what are the barriers and enablers faced by attempts to create or catalyze these learning ecosystems? By the end of this, I hope you leave with a sense that you can begin to think about the design of learning ecosystems in your region. The agenda for today is basically going through a couple of reasons for why I think we should be designing differently now, a definition of what learning ecosystems are, and then our 3 case studies, one from Catalonia, another from Chicago in the USA, and then the RSA Cities of Learning in the UK. The final 20 minutes will be reviewing these questions. Does this represent a new paradigm? And what are the challenges and enabling conditions? And if we have time at the end, we can go into a couple of questions. Great. So why should we be designing differently now? I'm going to go over about 4 points and then zoom back out to the big picture again. Because of this rapid change, it's pretty well known that lifelong learning is an essential skill. And what's less appreciated is that many of us therefore become lifelong teachers. If you think about how marketers educate their customers, managers are coaching their reports, analysts are training clients to interpret data, engineers are sharing mindsets with their organizations. Really, the locus of learning and expertise is increasingly more distributed, and teaching is happening at every level. The second motivating force for why we should be designing differently is that an average career will consist of many roles across domains. Here's a short snippet from McKinsey's 2017 report that providing job retraining and enabling individuals to learn marketable new skills throughout their lifetime will be a critical challenge, and for some countries, the central challenge. Mid-career retraining will become ever more important as the skill mix needed for a successful career changes. And so this raises the question of how do we design learning to be interoperable and transferable? How do we create new practices and norms where we teach for skills and knowledge transfer across domains and maybe across countries as the world becomes more globalized and people move around a lot more? Motivating force number 3 would be a take on what to do in the face of all this automation. As we know, robots and machines are taking over more and more jobs, and our relationship to technology is changing. So how do we develop pathways for roles that humans can reliably outperform machines on or acquire that human nuance? raises the question of what is uniquely human work. And I'd say there's roughly 5 categories here, which are create and curate, communicate, connect, teach, care and support. These are things which humans will probably be doing for a very long time, even with all the automation. And the final motivating factor for why I feel like we should be designing differently now is just the exhaustion of the existing educational paradigm. In many systems, not all of them, top-down reforms have created a number of perversities, things like unprecedented anxiety and stress level of students, normally associated with the high-stake assessments, disillusioned and burnt-out teachers, normally linked to high accountability regimes, and a tendency for schools and practitioners to avoid risk-taking and therefore squashing the potential for emergent innovative practices. So where is all this innovation that we're looking for going to come from? So zooming back out again, big picture, what kinds of education systems can keep pace with this rate of change? Really, this talk is more about igniting some conversation around designing trusted learning outside of changing how schools operate or the design of single siloed programs. Mostly questions, there are some answers, but really just to stimulate this discussion. So enter the ecosystem. This is a pretty old idea, and I just want to provide some historical context. In 1971, you have Ivan Illich writing about deschooling society, where he starts to reimagine the relationship between resources outside of the school, experts who are not traditional educators, allowing kids to be more mobile in communities. This is really where we see the emergence of some of this thinking and writing. In 1977, you have Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan is a media theorist. He notices that information environment around us is changing in the 70s, mainly with radio and television. And he basically posits that more information moves into a child's mind through these new mediums than it does in school. This is kind of Marshall McLuhan thinking about this back in the 70s. In 1996, roughly around then, you have business and management theory adopting the idea of ecosystems, and also complexity economics, thinking about ecosystem approaches to things. And 2007 is an interesting mark because Airbnb starts to come into the scene. Airbnb is one of those early technologies, which we're all probably aware of, which starts to change the interaction between humans and the spaces that we live in. It was inconceivable before Airbnb that you could spend 3 weeks over there and leave and go somewhere else, and that would be totally mediated by some kind of tech platform. Between 2007 and 2019, you have the emergence of groups like Remake Learning, LRNG, Cities of Learning, Educaso 360, which are our early learning ecosystems that we start to see emerge. Some of these we'll be covering in the case studies, and you'll go check them out. In 2019, we have Zachary Stein's influential book, Education in a Time Between Worlds. And this starts to really poke at the idea of distributed campuses, the idea that there are community centers and all sorts of support systems around schools that are teched out, have great facilities, mentors, tutors that many learners can engage with and move between. So fast forward, here we are in 2020 with an old idea and some new tech. Platform marketplaces like Uber, Airbnb, etc., have validated that new interactions between humans and their worlds are possible in different sectors. But unlike those examples, learning ecosystems are messy, they're multi-sided, they're riddled with incentive alignment issues. So let's explore if they're really the solution. To do that, let's arrive at a bit of a shared definition. So deriving from the field of evolutionary biology, an ecosystem is a community of interdependent organisms acting in conjunction with the natural environment. Therefore, a learning ecosystem is an open and evolving community of interdependent learning providers and services that cater to the variety of a learner's needs in a given context or area. So see how this is implicating that there's a responsiveness to an environment in a given area and this kind of open and evolving community of learning provisions. In that definition, we could include networks of schools where the partnerships are alone controlled wholly by that school or state. That does fit into this definition, but for this talk, I'll be focusing on a subset of that, those learning ecosystems which have the features of diversifying learning resources and pathways for learners, activating and sharing resources for learning in new ways from diverse sources. Those learning ecosystems which are porous around the edges, meaning that they're easy to join and leave, and are somehow supported by some helpful technical infrastructure, whether that be a platform or some tools. Those ecosystems which are comprised of formal and informal learning institutions, traditional and new, and have some form of distributed governance. At the heart of all of these learning ecosystems is the idea of learner agency, and also perhaps an attempt to meet 21st century challenges in some way beyond academic attainment. So that's what we're looking at today. The ecosystem metaphor is quite appealing for some reason. It's attractive for a couple of reasons. It's because ecosystems both provide and require a couple key ideas. This idea of capturing the advantages of centralization or harnessing the advantages of decentralized organization. The notion of diversity, maximum productivity, dynamic and adaptive scalability are all included in this metaphor. So in practice, capturing the advantages of centralization while harnessing the advantages of decentralization in learning ecosystems basically means there's much more capability for an education system to explore and exploit opportunities. Decentralized groups can detect fringe opportunities, they can move quicker in some ways, and central processes can build rapidly to support because there's already that centralization of resources and process. The idea of diversity in learning ecosystems basically maps to multiple providers fulfilling many roles of support and inspiration to learners. The way that maximum productivity is invoked in this is that there's the resources cycling within the ecosystem, the knowledge, the expertise, the tools are distributed and allocated based on learner needs, and the idea that nothing goes to waste. The notion of dynamic and adaptive means that ecosystems can respond to learner needs and changes into institutional environments and even market demands. And the idea of scalability, we've seen learning ecosystems at the global level, as we did with Galileo, those at the national level, as well as maybe just a campus. So learning ecosystems are scalable. But we're going to be focusing on those learning ecosystems at the city level. Diverse places for learning exist in every community, but the connective tissue making it a vibrant ecosystem does not. You can imagine all the code academies, the STEAM centers, science labs, libraries, museums, parks, historical sites. All of these places are rich places of learning, but that connective tissue is somehow missing. And so the core idea here is really to you break it down into 5 steps. There's much more that goes on behind the scenes to make this happen, but the core idea here is these 5 pieces. You need to map the city's learning resources, enable players to add to that map or directory to surface learning experiences and provisions. Then support a learner to create a custom learning schedule based on their interests. The third piece is to then support the learners to make use of resources and embed themselves in these communities with the support of mentors or facilitators, maybe even tooling. And then also supply some kind of virtual and physical wraparound support for that learner. Finally, bring all that learning together into a record of learning on a digital portfolio and verifying that learning with new forms of credentialing or assessment. I'll give you a bit more of a sense of how this might be possible. This is a mock-up of a screen that a learner might see. So they wake up and you can see in the top right here, their goal might change. They might want to reskill, they might want to explore, they might want to be focused on socialization. Whatever the goal is here, the learning pathway can adapt. They might say something like, my day has started with a notification about a suggested learning journey. The experience is a mixture of in-person workshops, online content, and a facility where I can work on my 3D printing project. I can always access online content support from my dashboard. So here you have the map of the city, all the learning provisions and resources are mapped. This pathway is being created. You can see some of those on the left, and maybe they can select from them and bring them into their pathway. And there's always this wraparound support. Great. Cool. Let's bring it out of the theory a little bit into some case studies. I just wanted to kick off the case studies by returning to our definition. So learning ecosystems are open and evolving communities of interdependent learning providers and services that cater to the variety of learner needs in a given context or area. So our first case study is Educatio 360. Educatio 360, or full-time learning, was founded in 2017. It's an alliance of municipalities and partners committed to making high-quality out-of-school learning opportunities available to all children and young people in Catalonia. This is really focusing on extracurricular and academic learning. So this is a extended offer. It's not something that replaces schools, but is augmenting what's already happening in schools. The Alliance consists of 52 local authorities, 48 primary and high schools, 46 education centers, and these are sort of private education centers, 16 leisure or sports networks, and across 11 localities. The ages that it serves are primary through secondary, and I didn't find any data on how many learners have been impacted to date, but found that 3,500 were included in their early pilots. They verify learning using a custom badging approach, which is still in development. And so their badging will be location specific, meaning like Catalonia will know what learning looks like and how they verify that learning in Catalonia. They also use a custom tech platform to share all of this learning with their audience. Some other cool features include this kind of focus on policy and political advocacy to enshrine the entitlement to high quality out of school learning. And a big reason for its success has been a coalition of foundations. If you see in the bottom, there's 3 foundations here. And this has really been the core driver for activating these deep networks. And the funding is coming from outside of the traditional systems. After the pilots, the governance and funding of the learning ecosystem will be held by state authorities. So you can see on the right here, very large area, lots of locations, 11 localities. What can we learn from them? So there's a couple of cool things going on. They have a very convincing manifesto, which sets a common goal for municipalities and other partners. This has been a key factor for their success. They've also noticed that there's issues of school readiness. So some schools just aren't equipped or are under too much load to think about these things. So this raises the question of how do we assess school readiness for such initiatives? They also noticed that each locality is unique in its approach. And this might come with the issue of siloed learning. So hence the custom badging platform to aid in the sharing and integration. And also they've been running these network events to share learnings between pilot programs. The next case study is Chicago's City of Learning. Now, this is the original stimulus and exemplar city-based learning ecosystem. Back in 2017, the mayor's office went all in and, without doing pilot-esque programs, helped orchestrate over 120,000 learning activities across the city with the support of the MacArthur Foundation and Mozilla Foundation. So this is 120 plus organizations offering informal learning for the ages of 4 to 24. In the first summer, it served around 945 students, and then has gone on since to serve about 20,000 young people each summer. So to verify all this learning, they're using the DYN badge framework. This is, if you look here on the right, we have dispositions, knowledge, skills, and showcase. And showcase is something more like a project, something that you show off. The tech platform that this is enabled on is LRNG. LRNG are also responsible for about 16 cities in the US, where Chicago is the biggest. I think it brings most of their traffic and users. And like I said, there was a focus on STEAM opportunities, driven by the MacArthur Foundation and Mozilla Foundation. Again, notice the foundations are central to getting these things off the ground at the moment. What can we learn from them? They have an interesting grant-making process for providers to join. So small organizations can receive up to $5,000 to create design challenges, and playlists are their idea of these learning pathways. They receive some technical assistance to create these badges and get on the platform. And of all the examples of these 3 learning ecosystems and many of the other ones that I've looked into, this is the most learner-centric in its design, both in terms of the platform, but also in terms of the learner pathways. These playlists are often designed by industry. And if they've noticed that if they aren't designed with young people in mind, they'll fail to gain the traction and the opportunities won't be explored. So they've set up a youth council to test and review the content on the platform. Awesome. Into our third and final one, the RSA's Cities of Learning. So this was conceived in 2015. And the pilots have been running in 2019, 2020, just before the pandemic. So I think it made it a little bit hard for them. There's 4 cities in the UK who are involved in the initiative, 60 plus industry partners serving the ages of 16 to 25. Only Around 500 learners have been in pilots, and the impact data is coming soon. The reason why there's been little impact data or even learning experiences delivered is because the RSA have taken a big focus on working closely with municipal leaders to develop these innovative mindsets and provide them with these services, things like program design, accreditation, marketing support, city onboarding, national partnerships, impact evaluation. So they've really been trying to think about the enabling factors and the enabling services as they've partnered with these 4 cities. They use the IMS's open badges. I don't know if anyone's familiar with these, but they look like this. Go to the IMS. I find this quite interesting just because the IMS also have one of the more adhered to interoperability standards in the world. Things like Blackboard and edX use their interoperability standards. The open badges, I think, has got a pretty good chance of being a real winner here. And then they also use a custom tech platform. It's currently national and city-based funding, but the goal is to be 100% funded by cities with national and municipal governance. Lots of things to learn here. There's a lot of industry and municipal buy-in. I think for the cities, they're very motivated by a focus on civic outcomes. And for employers, they're very focused on developing local talent who are work ready. Like I said, that in the last slide, there's been a focus on services to enable the ecosystem. So the RSA have a sort of consulting arrangement with municipal leaders. They really it's filtered by those groups with leadership that acknowledges that lifelong learning is crucial to the success and identity of the city. So there are other cities which they could have partnered with, but those cities that have the readiness and see that as a core part of their operations start to work with the RSA first. From the early pilots, we've seen that in the prototyping, people have really valued that they could create their own learning pathways into work, education, or training. And they really wanted that flexibility to forge the learning pathway, to build on their personal interests and passions. And there was also an experiment to see that if you gave a learner the ability to collect 3 to 4 badges, that it might unlock a new work experience, placement, or further learning. And this turned out quite well. So there's a real sense that the learners in the network are motivated to see this as part of their progressing them and developing and want to collect more of these badges. So I hope you have a bit more of a sense of kind of what's being built and the size and scale of these initiatives is looking like. I wanted to move into the next section just by asking this question in chat. So I'll stop sharing my screen a second, but wanted to ask you to share in chat. How would you notice innovation if it was happening in your sector? What would the signals be that you're looking out for? So I'm going to stop sharing and move over to chat. How would you notice innovation? What would the signals of innovation be in your sector? It's a couple minutes to answer. Are there any hallmarks or areas where you could detect it? A signal people will share in the social media. So that's definitely one signal. Incredible changes or improvements, yes. New products and processes. Leading organizations start doing it. Okay, yeah, okay, cool. Very nice, very nice. So there's, different angles on this, really. How would we know if innovation was happening? Does this represent a new paradigm? This is the question I'm after. If you are familiar with Clayton Christensen's work, he was made famous by the Innovator's Dilemma or the Jobs to be Done framework. It was a great book, Innovator's Dilemma, but basically came to at least 6 hallmarks of disruptive innovation. Learning ecosystems poke at all of these in different ways. So disruptive innovation will have new and bigger goals. So we see learning ecosystems engaging with real problems of our world in ways that schools working alone cannot. That's a bigger goal. They also focus on that kind of learning and education, which goes beyond academic attainment. So giving learners networks, the development of character, embedding them in communities and giving them a sense of belonging. So these are all kind of new and bigger goals. We'll see the emergence, I think someone said this in the chat, the new skills, new roles, new processes, new expertise coming out. So we see teachers relating to and working with other partners. We also see the emergence of new roles such as couriers, ambassadors, connectors, weavers, to name a few. Then disruptive innovation tends to come from that blind spot, which not the highest paying focus of the audience can't tend to see, which is why companies tend to invest in R&D to go and look for those areas which are underserved. And so a key driver of the learning ecosystems is basically a lot of these leaders identify that there's inequity in education. And so there's a strong focus on the underserved. And this tends tends to be where innovation starts happening. It might even come at a bit of the profit margins aren't so high, it doesn't make as much money, but really that's where we start to see it emerge from. Another hallmark of it is new players and new power relationships. So there's already one big power switch, which is learner agency, particularly in their choice of learning and maybe even their voice in the network, for them to shape the future of the network and say, vote and say, what do we want to see? You also see new players emerging into the blueprint of education. You see the engagement of business and also the cultural sector, all forming these new power relationships of inclusive governance. And this is a very tricky subject, a whole talk in itself. You also see shape-shifting. You see, similar to the way that co-working, co-living took the world by storm, you see the new use of commercial space, which is changing the boundaries of learning. Another hallmark, new business models and technologies. Definitely lots of new technologies here, and perhaps business models in the future. And then new metrics. So if you're familiar with Crick's work in learning power assessments, I believe that using learning power at the center of these learning ecosystems to support learners to take advantage of what's going on and to support their self-leadership and their agency. These are new ways that we're seeing new metrics interact with learning ecosystems. We're also seeing the use of digital badges. So again, new forms of measuring these things and new organizing powers. So that's it from the perspective of hallmarks. Another way we can approach this question is to think about the way that learning ecosystems impact existing learning provisions. So we have this 2x2 here with those learning ecosystems which are very learner-driven, all the way to those which are trying to adhere to curriculum. Then you have those learning ecosystems which are more intentionally designed, and then those learning ecosystems which are a bit more emergent and loose in their shape. And so a learning ecosystem could impact existing learning provisions in not just one of these ways, but some overlapping combination of them. If we start on the top left, you have your sort of industry or community-led, where the demands for what learning provision should be there is coming from outside of education. So this might be industry saying we need these pathways to get people here quickly. This has the ability to disrupt traditional modes of learning by circumventing or sidelining formal education. And here you see low student choice matched by high partner freedom. So the industry is crafting what's going on and building stricter curriculum. And that dictation is coming from there. And flip side of that, you have in the bottom left, expanded formal offers. So we saw this with Catalonia, where this is about more augmenting existing schools. You have schools who are noticing that they want to provide some kind of organized learning to better meet 21st century challenges, and so might deploy a learning ecosystem around them. In the bottom right, you have new designs and platforms. There's a really interesting case study, I wish I'd shared it actually. The Met, which is I think in Rhode Island. There's a very high degree of learner agency and intentional design. The Met is actually a learning ecosystem as a school. So it's one campus, which is a learning ecosystem. They create pathways. This can replace a school. They also scale quite well because there's the wholesale design of that organized learning. We did this at Galileo, where a certain design or a certain learning experience was really easy to teach someone else how to do that. They did it somewhere else, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it scales quite well. Top, you have these purely theoretical learning ecosystems. This might emerge as we transition this way. But high learner agency, self-sustaining providers, we don't have any examples of this, but these basically would challenge the role of the existing system, and they would be directly sensitive to economic conditions and learner demand at the same time. So they'd be adapting, there'd be shared governance, all of these different providers building new resources based on these kind of factors, on learner demand and economic. Right now, I think the most promising tends to be in this bottom right corner. I wanted to just take a breath and pause to let you guys answer a question. Before I step into what some of the challenges are and also go into key takeaways and summary, I just wanted to ask the question in chat. That after seeing all of this and based on your already existing experience of some learning ecosystems, perhaps those at the corporate level or at the city or at the national level, what do you think the biggest issues that learning ecosystems faces if they're to be implemented? Give a couple minutes in chat. Mindset, that's been a huge one. Structural change of the education system, teachers' attitudes, mindsets coming up a bit. Assessments. Biggest challenge might be quality for reaching resources and networks. Financial support, another big one. This new technology. Brilliant, awesome. Thank you guys. Yeah, these are some we're coming all the right angles. Thank you for your answers. So I think the simple way of saying this is that there's the same thorny issues that education reformers have always faced, plus those that are specific to learning ecosystems. So you can think about the ways that we evidence learning for multiple stakeholders to interpret the results, defining, developing, and quality assuring that professional and other roles, any balance between the quality and consistency of learning that's provided and the scale of the learning ecosystem, balancing diversity and localism. How much should we be, pulling in resources from other places, and how much should we just be revealing what's in the locality? And the big one, as you've seen, is how to ensure sustainable funding. And more specifically to learning ecosystems, you have these challenges of how to realize this authentic joint governance. I'll get into that in a little bit later. How to assess the merit or other forms of reputation of different players. So at Galileo, we had the challenge of figuring out which of our coaches or facilitators or mentors and learning experience designers, like how do we assess merit for them? These are new roles. What does that say about what voice and weight they have in the decision-making? More related to that third point on how to balance quality and consistency, you have to think about how open or closed you should be making these marketplaces, right? So are you going to have a eBay style marketplace where anyone can put anything on, or are you going to have a more closed marketplace, a bit more like Airbnb? Despite everyone thinking that Airbnb, anyone could put anything on Airbnb, they still have quite strict guidelines and regulations and rules for the quality that they're looking for. So how open or closed should these marketplaces be? If you're doing this at the city level and delivering to young learners, the question of transport comes up, and also technical platform governance. What's the proper relationship between the tech provider and any sort of municipal or national powers that it has to relate to? All in all, I really think there's an opportunity for public authorities to create the space to incentivize and enable these learning ecosystems. Again, they're so emergent, but there's a lot of space to be supporting that kind of that innovation. And so I wanted to wrap with a bit of a summary, which will be reflecting on some of the key insights, to give you some sort of key takeaways or things to think about, as well as some tools and methods, which I found quite helpful in designing these things. And the way I want to break down the summary and the enabling conditions is to think about 4 categories: the governance and funding piece, the roles piece, the effective context and place, and assessment. So on governance and funding, we've seen that because learning ecosystems rely on voluntary opt-in and the set of learners' needs are so broad and diverse, players have to find ways to realize this authentic joint governance or this joint leadership. Without it, you probably can't scale the learning ecosystem because the learners' needs will likely be unmet. Just because if you're going past a couple thousand, then you'll be stuck. You really need to figure out how to work closely with the partners. Then we've seen in many cases, I think more than the majority, catalytic funding has been essential from outside of the public funded education system. You see this with a coalition of businesses creating funds or foundations coming together during the initiation or after proof of concept phase. This is also great because they activate really deep networks. And then as we saw with the Chicago example, the ability to distribute central funds to smaller organizations makes a really good scaling strategy. So getting clear on all of these players and moving parts and value chains, I really suggest looking at the platform design toolkit. You can think of this as the business model canvas for ecosystems design. It's made by a group called Boundaryless, a brilliant group, helped many other platform marketplaces and ecosystems get off the ground by seeing what the interactions are and the expectations are of everybody in that ecosystem. So check out the platform design toolkit. On roles, there's the re-envisioning or supporting the role of teachers. So teachers we've seen in schools cannot be expected to hold multiple relationships without support because they're under a lot of stress. So the introduction of new roles, weavers, ambassadors who build the network, or internship coordinators is essential. And it raises the question of redefining the role of teachers. We at Galileo, we thought of them as coaches who enable learner agency. They share mindsets, they help them set goals and how to navigate the socialization and the complex problem solving. We also see experts who are not educators. Of course, this comes with the question of quality control and safeguarding, but lots of experts coming in, graduates as mentors, employees in industry supporting youth programs, small business owners and providers stepping in to provide learning provisions. So mapping this, coming back to the learning ecosystem, the ecosystems mapping exercise is really helpful. Once you know all the players in the ecosystem, I think using Remake Learning's 5Cs framework and their playbook is great for organizing the network and bringing your people together. Do check out Remake Learning. They're one of the really exemplar groups. On context and place, what you offer is bound up with the ecosystem's relationship to its historical, cultural, and industrial backdrop. And there was a question in chat. The RSA are working with a group to think about finding new ways of interpreting labor market data. So this is doing sort of scrapes on keywords that are used across all the job positions, which are going out. And they're using that market data to adapt the provisions, design the badges and pathways that allow that ecosystem to update in response to the environment. It's being actively explored, but it's still very early days. Again, school readiness. Some schools won't be ready. How do you assess school readiness if you are going to be engaging schools? And then, as we saw with Galileo, we worked closely with lots of new buildings and businesses because we saw that they were open and quicker to upskilling. So some groups would offer, some locations, learning hubs would offer cross-functional spaces like a co-working space and a daycare, or co-working space and learning center. These were really beneficial partners to us. So I highly recommend focusing on those groups. Bringing it all together, you can look at tech platforms such as LRNG, or as we're developing with the city as a school, my team, or will you build something custom? How will you show all of this learning and the pathways to the learner? Where will that portfolio be based? And finally, on assessment, two buckets here. You can seek to change the existing formal assessment to reflect that diversity of learning experiences and outcomes, or you can look at kind of building alternative graduation routes separate from high school. The digital badges, I think, are a key piece in all of this, whether that's a custom solution, DYN, IMS. There's also groups like the T3 Innovation Network who are exploring, if you're familiar with LRS technology, which is learning record stores, all these groups. I think this is probably about 5 years before we really get this off the ground to say, yes, we can have really shared standards for how we evidence this learning, but worth checking out what's happening. And then assessment to support learner agency. Well, you might have already attended Dr. Ruth Crick's work. I really think learner agency, how would we know if we were supporting leadership in our learners? I think Wild and another group called Lectica in the US have really great assessment tools for supporting coaching conversations between learners and their mentor, coach, whatever you'd like to call them. So before summarizing and finishing, the core idea here is to map the city's learning resources, create custom learning schedules for the learners to create custom learning schedules, support them to embed themselves in these communities and make use of those resources, provide that virtual and physical wraparound support, and bring it all together on a digital portfolio. And my parting comment and note is that this space is still in its maturation phase. It will require many experiments to be successful. While there's lots and lots of challenges, I really do think this is exposing a new frontier full of potential. And while the path towards these models of learning is quite formidable, it will be one that's a collective effort, one which isn't driven by any one organization alone. We've seen parents, community leaders, public and private institutions, charities and caregivers all coming together to build that future. In this unique technological environment of our century, I think we're being presented with a golden opportunity, one to use community, policy, and technology to reimagine the relationship between learners, teachers, resources, their work, and our world. Thank you.
Great. I think in the interest of keeping our break, I'd like to just end questions for now, but I'm sure Mr. Hunt would be happy for you to engage with him outside of this workshop. I think he's contactable. I'm not sure if in the slides it has your contact information info.
It does.
Otherwise, yeah, thank you again for engaging in this workshop. I think it's quite an interesting presentation. I know personally when I first heard about when you were sharing kind of ecosystem approaches to learning and decentralized learning in that other conference we were in, I thought it was it's quite mind-blowing. I didn't realize that this sort of stuff was going on. I wanted to have an opportunity to have you share it with some more participants from across our APO member countries.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I hope this initiates some fun discussions in your regions.